Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca. Welcome everyone to the investor briefing on the Bhopal disaster 40 years on. My name is Liz Umlas. I will be the moderator for this briefing. I'm a senior fellow at Croatan Institute and a lecturer at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And I will introduce our distinguished panel in a moment. First, just a couple of small housekeeping items. All participants are on mute by default, and we kindly ask that everyone remain on mute throughout the briefing to improve sound quality. The briefing is being recorded right now, and it will be shared with all registrants, and it'll be posted on the Investor Alliance website afterwards. If you could leave your cameras on during the session, that would be great, and make sure that your name and organization are visible in your Zoom square. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the chat function at any point. Our speakers will try and answer those questions as they come in. And if we don't get to them during the speakers part, we will address them in a Q&A session towards the end. And now I'm honored to introduce our speakers. Gabriela Quijano, who is an independent business and human rights specialist and advisor. Gabby is also the lead author of Amnesty International's recent report, Bhopal, 40 Years of Injustice. We also have with us Rachna Dhingra, who is the India coordinator for the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal. We have Tim Edwards, executive trustee, the Bhopal Medical Appeal. Amishi Singh, who is a member of the Business and Human Rights Coordination Group at Amnesty International USA and a student activist. And we have Bennett Freeman, Associate Fellow at Chatham House and formerly Senior Vice President of Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments. So before I turn to the speakers, I wanted to take a few minutes to set the stage with some opening remarks. Many of you will be aware of the tragic events of the 2nd to 3rd of December 1984, when a leak of deadly methyl isocyanate gas at a plant of Union Carbide India Limited killed over 22,000 people in the town of Bhopal in India and caused suffering to over 500,000 others. Many of you may also be aware that because this catastrophe was never properly addressed, its legacy continues. The 40th anniversary of the Bhopal disaster is in just 6 weeks, and our briefing today is meant to provide key findings and recommendations from Amnesty International's report on Bhopal. We also want to give voice to advocates who are working with Bhopal survivors. This briefing is open to everyone, but it's geared towards investors, and our goal is twofold. We hope to build investor awareness of the justice delayed and denied to survivors in Bhopal, and also to encourage investors to engage Dow Chemical Corporation, which bought Union Carbide Corp over 20 years ago, to accept its responsibility once and for all. Until now, Dow has been unresponsive to attempts to get it to do so, and 40 years is too long to wait for justice. Since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles in 2011, there's been a growing understanding by companies and investors that remedy, far from being the domain only of the states, is part of corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And under the guiding principles, all enterprises are expected to undertake human rights due diligence. For investors, that includes knowing whether companies in their portfolios, including index funds, are or have been involved in serious human rights violations. If you hold Dow shares and you're here today, that's an important step, as you'll hear directly from advocates who have worked on this case. Investors are also expected to use their leverage to ensure that Dow addresses the legacy of the Bhopal tragedy. Dow was not responsible for the original disaster, but in acquiring Union Carbide, it has, as Amnesty International points out, become directly linked to impacts on the community, and therefore it has the responsibility to address the legacy of egregious violations. That is the human rights case here. It's a tragedy that has caused monumental suffering, and many would also argue that it's the most significant unresolved corporate accountability issue in the world today. And that is why it's still salient for investors in 2024. A few words about the broader context. The legislative landscape is changing. We are gradually moving from a decades-long emphasis on voluntary initiatives towards mandatory human rights due diligence, including access to remedy for survivors. In addition, multiple jurisdictions are or will soon be requiring double materiality reporting. And that means that companies must disclose not only the impacts sustainability issues have on them, but the impacts that corporate operations have on society and the environment. And although financial materiality is essential for investors, we want to emphasize again the human rights case. Bhopal is, in fact, an emblematic human rights case that underscores how difficult it remains in 2024 for survivors of corporate-related human rights violations to gain access to justice. As we will hear, although 4 decades have passed, the after effects of this tragedy will not disappear. Local communities and survivor groups continue to organize. Student activists are mobilized. Amnesty International continues its crucial research and advocacy around the tragedy, calling attention to the miscarriage of justice and appealing to investors to step up to their responsibility. So turning now to the format of the rest of this event, our first speaker will be Gabby, and Gabby's going to present Amnesty International's report, and she'll provide some of the details on the disaster and the ongoing impact, as well as Amnesty's recommendations to Dow and to investors. And then we'll have an interview format where I will interview our other speakers, Rachna, Tim, Amishi, and Bennett, and they will talk about, among other things, the lived experience of people on the ground, as well as the mobilization of survivors, ongoing advocacy efforts, and the role of investors. And then finally, in the last few minutes, we will have question and answers. But as I say, if you have questions during the proceedings, please feel free to put those into the chat. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Gabby Quijano. Gabby, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Liz. Thank you for this opportunity to present the Amnesty report. I just wanted to start by saying that Amnesty has been campaigning for justice and accountability in Bhopal for 20 years. And to mark the 40th anniversary coming up now in December, Amnesty released this new report called 40 Years, Bhopal, 40 Years of Injustice, not just to mark the anniversary, but also to commemorate the victims and to provide an update on the situation on the ground and to add our voice to the cause for reparation and full accountability that campaigners have been pursuing for the last 4 decades. For those who are not aware of the specifics of the case, I'll reiterate a few key facts. Like Liz said, on the night of the 2nd of December of 1984, a deadly gas called methyl isocyanate, or MIC, began to leak from a storage tank of a pesticide plant in the city of Bhopal in India. As many as 10,000 people are believed to have died within 3 days of the leak. Children under the age of 10 died in large numbers. 570,000 people were exposed to the toxic gas, and those who survived developed many chronic and debilitating illnesses connected to gas exposure, and many of them eventually died a premature death from these illnesses. As many as 22,000 people are believed to have died from gas-related afflictions over the years and decades that followed. The pesticide plant was operated by Union Carbide India Limited, an Indian company majority owned by the US-based company Union Carbide Corporation, which I will call UCC from now on. And 5 days after the leak, the UCC's chairman was arrested, but then he was released on bail and he left India and never came back. And all extradition attempts ever since have failed. In 1987, UCC was charged with culpable homicide, but the company, being in the US, never appeared before the Indian courts to face the charges. In 1992, UCC was declared a fugitive from justice and has remained in this character to this day. Many civil claims were also filed in the USA after the tragedy, all of them eventually dismissed by one single judge, Judge Kinnan, on preliminary matters. This means that the merits of the case were never adjudicated. In September 1986, the government of India filed a claim against UCC for $3.3 billion on behalf of the victims in India. In 1989, without consulting Bhopal survivors, the parties reached an out-of-court settlement for $470 million US dollars. This is less than 15% of the initial amount. Now, that amount was totally insufficient to cover the full extent of the harm. It was calculated based on false and incorrect information, and the insufficiency of the award amount became clearer as years went by and the figures for gas-related deaths and permanently injured people kept rising. In addition to the insufficiency of the amount, the system that was put in place to disperse the amounts of money was also highly inadequate. Many victims were wrongly categorized or could not register their claims, and this includes gas-exposed children and children born to gas-affected parents. And most people who received some compensation spent most of it in medical expenses alone. Now, in parallel to this catastrophe, ran another more invisible environmental disaster. During the years of operations, UCC ran the plant negligently, contaminating the surrounding environment with heavy metals. UCC abandoned the plant without ever decontaminating the site. And this means that left piles of contamination and unaddressed environmental contamination have contaminated the soil and groundwater and the water sources from the local villages. That has also affected their health. Now, where are we today? Like Liz mentioned briefly in her introduction, over 500,000 people continue to suffer some degree of injury today, 40 years later. Some gas-related diseases have got worse over time, and the health impacts are multi-generational. This means that the children and the grandchildren of those exposed to MIC are now showing signs of illnesses, including congenital birth defects. Healthcare for both gas and contamination affected people has been and continues to be highly inadequate. The toxic waste, as I said, continues to lie in and around the abandoned plant, and ongoing testing suggests that the contamination is spreading further from the plant site, affecting more and more communities. UCC still faces serious outstanding criminal charges in India concerning its role in the disaster. If I may just repeat, UCC is unable to operate in India, and an attachment order for its assets continues in place in India. Now, turning to Dow. In 2001, Dow bought UCC. The company knew or should have known at the time about outstanding human rights concerns in Bhopal, including that UCC was an absconder from justice in India and that the environmental contamination was rampant and now very well proven. And yet, UCC at the time denied any responsibility and maintained that UCC was a separate legal entity from it and continues to maintain this line today. Dow also denied that any liability still existed at the time. It maintains that line of response today, and it claims against all evidence that the disaster has been fairly settled, and even though it continues to shield UCC from pending criminal charges in India. In 2005, the Indian courts turned to Dow for assistance in producing UCC before the Indian courts. Between 2005 and 2023, the criminal court issued close to 10 summons for Dow to attend the criminal proceedings. Dow ignored all of the summons until the very last one in May of 2023. This is 18 years since the Indian court first issued summons for Dow to assist the court in producing UCC. Now, Dow appeared in October 2023 before the Indian court, only to say that the Indian court lacked any personal jurisdiction over it. It did not address the merits of the case, and it basically just referred to the same line of defense that it has always advanced, that UCC was and remains a separate legal entity from it. Dow and UCC are defendants in a public interest litigation case for environmental contamination before the Madhya Pradesh High Court, and this is a case that is still ongoing and is looking into the environmental contamination emerging from the emanating from the plant site. Now, Amnesty claims that Dow is failing to live up to its responsibility to respect human rights under the UNGPs and other international business and human rights standards. As Liz said at the beginning, Dow may not have caused the gas leak or the plant site contamination, but it became directly linked to their adverse human rights impacts and the ongoing failure at remediating them from the moment it purchased UCC in 2001. Dow exercises effective control over UCC, so it has leverage. Just to remind people, Dow is the full owner of UCC. Dow has failed to use this leverage to ensure UCC appears before the Indian courts and addresses all outstanding human rights issues in Bhopal. Now, Dow's ongoing failure to push UCC to appear before the Indian courts and address its outstanding human rights legacy over a prolonged period of time amounts to contribution. And this, in turn, triggers the obligation to remediate. Now, Dow states publicly that it operates in full accordance with the UNGPs. However, at no point has Dow attempted to justify its actions or its omissions regarding Bhopal through the lens of the UN Guiding Principles or any UNGPs-based due diligence process. So Amnesty has described Bhopal as a typical case of environmental racism. Environmental racism drove the decision to set up a highly dangerous chemical plant near poor and marginalized communities. And environmental racism lies at the root of the appalling response to the 1984 catastrophe and the ongoing contamination ever since. Of course, Indian authorities bear a huge amount of responsibility for the gas leak, for the ongoing contamination, and for the remediation. But Dow and UCC are the polluters. So they have a massive role to play, both for outstanding human rights concerns and for the current situation. So what is Amnesty asking Dow and UCC to do today? Provide additional compensation to survivors and contribute towards the cost of environmental cleanup, the cost of health monitoring, the cost of economic rehabilitation and healthcare for the affected population. And to Dow specifically, to reassess its responsibility regarding Bhopal through the lens of the UNGPs and fully disclose all its findings. And we think that this is the minimum that Dow could do, including towards investors that are concerned about Bhopal. And to cooperate fully with the Criminal Court of Bhopal and compel UCC to appear before the Criminal Court to face pending criminal charges. And Amnesty is also addressing other companies that have or are planning on having business relationships with Dow or UCC. So that includes investors. To firstly, raise concerns with the companies and use or increase their leverage to demand action on outstanding concerns in Bhopal, and to end any relationship with Dow or UCC if the companies fail to take meaningful and demonstrable action within a reasonable period of time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Gabby, for that comprehensive and really excellent overview, which is really helpful in laying out the landscape and the extent of the tragedy. And thank you also for being exactly on time. I'd like to now turn to our panel. So we will have a first round of questions for Rachna and Tim. And Rachna, I'd like to turn to you first. Can you tell us a bit about the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal and how you work with the international survivors of the Bhopal disaster? Specifically, what is their current lived experience of accessing the remedy that they need?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for allowing me to be here. ICJB is just a coalition that is mostly comprised of survivors of the disaster and organizations who have been fighting for justice and life of dignity for the last 40 years. There are many other international volunteers that are part of ICJB, but it is mostly run by the survivors organizations where we use education, grassroots organizing, and nonviolent direct action to hold Dow Chemical and Union Carbide and the Indian government accountable for the ongoing chemical disaster in India. So one of the things that I wanted people to understand that sometimes it's hard to even imagine that this happened, that things have gotten worse than what it was 40 years ago. So one, that things are worse than it was 40 years ago. Second, the disaster continues. The single event continues to kill, expose people even today. And, as investors, if you are investing with Dow, or if you're thinking of, you should know that this is a corporation and Union Carbide that is carrying out crimes, not only against, people in Bhopal, but also against the unborn children in Bhopal. They have been refusing to clean up their toxic waste, which has affected more than 150,000 people as we speak today. There are children with birth defects we are being born who then have to prove that, tell us these are the chemicals of carbide and Dow that has made your disability happen, because the chemicals are always going to be treated innocent until proven guilty. And I really don't like this whole thing of calling it a violation of human rights. This should be called as committing crimes, because violating human rights is too soft for what Dow and Carbide is doing purposefully, intentionally, with full knowledge. They're doing this. I'll just give you an example. For 17 years, we fought in Indian courts that Dow should be brought to court in the criminal matter because they bought a company that faced criminal charges of culpable homicide, grievous assault, and manslaughter. They bought this knowingly. And it took us 17 years to bring this corporation, Dow Chemical, to India. Last year, it happened after a lot of pressure from all kinds of individuals and Congress people. And in the last 1 year, all Dow has been saying that they are an American corporation and they will not abide by the jurisdiction of Indian courts. So they will continue to pollute, they will continue to kill, they will continue to disable a new generation, but they will not clean up their toxic waste. And most importantly, we have also seen, this is something, because this is a 40-year-old battle where people, the poorest and the most vulnerable, have fought against the most powerful corporations. But unless and until there is a forum to try these violations as crimes, unless and until there should be no morality talk in any of this. Because if Dow and Carbide had any morality, this disaster would have stopped happening many years ago. They have been charged with bribing, snooping on activists in 3 continents. There is nothing, no evil that they have not done, and only hope that we have that because there are enough criminal laws to take care of crimes committed by corporations like Union Carbide and Dow, but there is no international body to try them. And when we look at even UN, international bodies like UN and ILO and WHO have not done their duty towards Bhopal. If it was a natural disaster, maybe things would have been very different. So while having very clear laws, would say both countries saying, oh, polluter should pay. But here, the polluter is not only not paying, polluter is polluting, and it is doing more and more business in this country and in all over the world because of the political clout that allows them. And this is not just the political clout that they enjoy within the Indian government, but also in the US government as well, that they are allowed to walk free and do business and continue the harm to people in Bhopal today. There is study after study showing that there are children that are being born to gas-exposed parents have 8 times more rates of cancers. And this just does not stop. And all I hear every time is how Bhopal is a textbook case of all that has gone wrong. So I think the onus is on the corporation. Onus is on those investors who think of investing, or who think that there should be a better way of doing business. Let's at least fix one of the longest unprecedented disaster that has happened in the world. I think onus is on all of us. But people in Bhopal, have been very clear. Yes, they continue to fight. Yes, they continue to be sick, but they have said that they do not want to be considered expendable. They have said they are not flowers that should be offered at the altar of profit and power. They are flames committed to conquering darkness and to challenging those who threaten the planet and magic and mystery of life. And Carbide and Dow has done this, and it is not just about Bhopal. They have many skeletons in their closets, but at least for Bhopal, if the international community was to come together, if the investors were to come together on this very specific issue, that they bought a company knowing fully well what they did in Bhopal, took over all their assets, continue to do business, selling their technologies in India and in other places, and literally have gotten away with murder.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachna, for vividly illustrating the continued reality facing survivors in Bhopal and the utter lack of access to justice. I turn to you now, Tim. Can you share with us the work that Bhopal Medical Appeal is undertaking and how this work has tried to address some of the things that Rachna was speaking about?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for inviting me to speak to everyone here today. The entire absence of any remotely adequate form of remedy is what's made our charitable work necessary and vital for thousands of people in Bhopal. And for the last 30 years, the Medical Appeal has carried out fund and awareness raising work to support medical and community work of two organizations in Bhopal, the Sambhavna Trust and Chingari Trust, which looks after second and third generation victims. In our experience over 30 years, the need for the support that we're providing to our partners has only grown and continues to grow. The circumstances in which they both work in Bhopal are extremely challenging. Sambhavna is the only medical centre offering entirely free treatment to survivors of both the gas and contaminated water disasters. It has so far registered and successfully eased the suffering of over 35,000 patients using a combination of modern and Ayurvedic medicines and yoga. And it's also enlisted over 100 community volunteers from the local areas to work on public health education and interventions right across thousands of people in local communities. Sambhavna depended on international funding up until 2019. We were the core funders of Sambhavna. It currently depends upon local funding. Chingari Trust was founded by two women survivors, and it provides physiotherapy, speech therapies, and educational therapies to between 200 and 250 damaged children in Bhopal every day. Having children born with birth defects in their own families, the two women knew very well the pressure, grief, worry, extra work, and cost of caring for a damaged child, and that there was no help at all to be had from the state. As Gabby explained, as Rachna mentioned, the children are not acknowledged as victims of Union Carbide's chemicals, have had no compensation, and are not entitled to the few meagre benefits that the gas victims receive. The women planned their centre to run on the lines of a primary school, where children come for the day, grieving mothers are giving mothers some hours of freedom. Those who need physiotherapy to help unlock stiff limbs and paralyzed bodies receive regular treatment. To prepare a child for life outside the straitjacket of disability, the basic skills of daily living, bathing, eating, meals on the road, learning to hold spoons and cups, utensils, or even a pencil are taught at the centre. Children move on to special education sessions, training them to maintain eye contact, recognise and name colours, write their own names. This is really fundamental life skill building work the centre is doing. Those able to begin formal education with some are able to begin formal education with the eventual aim of moving to ordinary schools. Many second and third generation victims are born with congenital deformities such as cleft lip or impaired hearing. Speech therapy is important as it helps the kids convey their needs and feelings, which in turn helps them to integrate the society at large. I could go on about Chingari services, but I wanted to say before I run out of time that really the reason that none of this is vital work is nearly sufficient. And it's because there is just this enormous quantum of need in the city. So Chingari and Sambhavna set out to provide models of response to the predicaments faced by gas and water contamination survivors and families with second and third generation victims. Thousands of people currently depend on state hospitals to manage the permanent injuries they've been left with. And Chingari has a waiting list of 3 to 4 times the number of kids it's able to reach each day. So the need vastly outweighs what we're able to provide as a charitable organization. Economics are at the center of the entire medical crisis. For survivors, many of whom are out of work or caring for sick and dying relatives, their dependence on failing local services, and even after which they're forced to spend on average nearly 30% of their household incomes on medicines, even today. And this is a direct consequence of the profound insufficiency of civil compensation, something that the Indian government has itself termed a gross miscarriage of justice and a perpetration of irremediable injustice. So at the same time, new victims continue to be created by the contamination crisis. Some 200,000 people are now stuck in its pathways as it reaches new wells and new wombs. None of those being exposed have been compensated or benefit from official recognition. Only the partners in Bhopal offer them any form of free medical or therapeutic service. So the need for our support is not going to go away anytime soon.
Thanks, Tim. I think it's your answer helps people to understand about the costs being turned back onto society due to company and government failure to pick these up. A very short second round to Rachna and Tim. Rachna, if you could just take a minute or two and tell us, what is it that survivors expect of Dow? Do we still have Rachna? I'm not sure. She may have lost access. Okay, Tim, then I'll turn to you. Just briefly, Amnesty's recommendations to Dow include that the company contribute a fair financial sum towards the cost of health monitoring and healthcare for the affected population. For investors, can you just break this down in terms of what it means for Dow?
Yes, I can try, Liz. It's very difficult to ring fence a clear figure for that kind of support. For example, for 40 years, in effect, the national and state governments have been funding that kind of medical monitoring and intervention in Bhopal. We don't even have clear figures for how much the national and state governments have spent over the years. It's estimated that the gas relief department in Bhopal is spending around 140 crores. I think at current exchange rates, that's about $17–18 million a year just on medical provision. But as we've heard, that provision has been inadequate, not fit for purpose. Many of the hospitals are understaffed or under-equipped. There's a general kind of sense of apathy, and no treatment protocols have been properly developed. There's been no proper monitoring in terms of recording people's illnesses and treatment patterns. So that money being spent on an annual basis in itself is grossly insufficient. I did a quick calculation before this session and established that between 1990 and 2010, the state and national government spent a total of around, well, at today's interpretation, and those figures will have to be adjusted for inflation and devaluation of the rupee, but around $250 million has been spent on medical interventions, on social and economic rehabilitation, and on pledges in terms of piecemeal remediation of surface wastes at the factory site that were left behind by the company. So you start to get a sense of really quite an enormous problem that potentially is going to take hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to move towards any kind of adequate remedy.
Thanks very much, Tim, for helping us with the specifics of contributing a fair sum. I'd like to turn now to Amishi. Amishi, the Bhopal Survivors Tour just completed, and I was wondering if you could tell us how students have been involved with sharing the experience of survivors with a broader population. Specifically, what efforts have students undertaken in the past, and what plans do students have to take this mobilization for survivors forward in the coming school year?
So students have always been a major part of the Bhopal movement, as the disaster is a clear example of the intersection between environmental racism, corporate accountability, and international law. The student-led campaign for justice in Bhopal was prominent in the US in the early 2000s, where they called on Dow Chemical to clean up Bhopal by pushing for divestment, shareholder action, and city resolutions. For example, students at the University of Michigan have previously passed a university resolution calling on Dow to clean up Bhopal and calling on the university to refuse all of the company's donations until it does, and have held protests in the Dow laboratory building, which is largely funded through Dow's donations. Students at The Ohio State University held a vigil for the survivors and a photo exhibition to highlight the harm caused to the communities due to the chemicals polluting Bhopal and to engage their peers. Now, thanks to the 2024 Bhopal Survivors Tour, a new generation of students are motivated to help the survivors get justice. With how ubiquitous social media is, students are able to reach more people and promote their actions further. And due to it being an election year in the United States as well, younger people are more motivated and energetic in taking actions to make the changes they wish to see. We are asking students to take action by holding educational events on the Bhopal gas tragedy, mobilizing for the week of action for the 40th anniversary of the tragedy, and demand that Dow pay for cleanup in Bhopal.
Great, thanks very much, Amishi. It's really encouraging to know that the next generations are continuing to shine a light on this tragedy. I'd like to turn to our final speaker, to Bennett. And my first question is to you now, turning to the investor side. A number of investors, including yourself while you were at Calvert, have taken steps in past years to engage on Bhopal. And I wonder if you could provide a brief recap of previous investor efforts to seek justice for survivors.
Yes, Liz, thank you. Before I answer the question, I just want to note that I joined Tim Edwards for a visit to Bhopal in December of 2017, and the second and third generation public health and individual birth defects that he mentioned are just so palpable, so visible, so visceral, so heartbreaking, and should motivate all of us to do whatever we can here to finally bring justice and remediation to survivors and second and third generation victims here. But having said that, there have been investor efforts over the years, beginning in the late 2000s, initiated partly by Amnesty International USA, and driven by people like Simon Bilinis, and assisted by shareholder advocacy experts like Sanford Lewis. At Calvert, we got into this issue in 2014, 2015, and we filed a shareholder resolution for the 2014-15 proxy season, asking Dow to disclose material risks to the company related to Bhopal, particularly related to liability, but also loss of business in India due to the legal and reputational challenges the company faced there, which we spent a lot of effort documenting. To our surprise, the company responded by not trying to knock out the resolution, but instead contacting us directly to ask what it would take for us to take down the resolution. And we responded that that would take a direct meeting with the CEO in the corporate headquarters in Midland, Michigan, which I undertook on behalf of Calvert with a colleague in May of 2015. And there was a subsequent meeting with the CEO I had in early 2019. But the investor side has really gone quiet the last several years. What we did propose to Dow at the time was a dialogue that could lead to a negotiation to produce a substantial settlement for victims, as well as remediation of the site that would not supplant but supplement the ongoing legal processes. And so at the time, there was a very clear business case, and I'm happy to explain next, if you'd like, Liz, where at least I think the business case may stand at this point. But there was this significant effort, and Amnesty really helped get the ball rolling and encourage us at Calvert at the time to take up the matter.
Thanks. That's really helpful background for investors on past engagement. And so coming back to your point, at the outset, I had mentioned that current legislation around mandatory human rights due diligence and disclosures have made double materiality reporting a requirement in many jurisdictions. You mentioned the ethical and business cases. I wonder if you could elaborate on both of those for investors to engage Dow on the legacy of Bhopal.
Yeah. So there was a very strong, solid business case for Dow to reach a settlement and to provide much greater compensation for victims based on the fact, and I mean fact, that in the 2010s, Dow growth in the Indian market was very modest, very limited relative to the growth of the chemical industry market overall, and of course, the fast-paced growth of the Indian economy. And I think at this point, and Tim can chide me later if he thinks I'm out of line here, but I think I can say publicly that the CEO of Dow conceded to me, acknowledged in our meeting in May of 2015, that in fact, the Bhopal issue was the major reason why the company's revenue growth in India was lagging what it should have been, really for fear of seizure of plant and equipment, and the concern that any investment in expanding facilities in the country would be stymied by the courts. So he did acknowledge privately at the time that there was a business case, which we spent a lot of effort with Tim and others in researching and documenting. Dow has subsequently, been merged with DuPont and then was reconstituted into 3 different corporate entities. But the main Dow itself continues and has in fact picked up commercial growth over the last several years in India. So there appears to be a less tangible, quantifiable business case at this point. However, there is potential still liability, legal liability for the company, which might compel it to find some way of settling to avoid even greater liability for itself down the road as one element of the business case. There's a less tangible but potentially powerful reputational case for the company, although the company has not faced reputational pressure really since the London Olympics of 2012. And then finally, and this is just critically important, is that investors are always looking for a business case. And I think that that business case is at least less tangible or quantifiable now than it was a decade ago. But there remains a more powerful than ever ethical case for the company to find a way to remediate the site and especially to provide compensation to the still suffering victims. And I think that it's critically important for all of our emphasis on a material business case to recognize the critical human importance of an ethical case, which is so powerful here. And as you said, Liz, at the outset, this is really the outstanding, greatest unresolved corporate accountability issue in the world. And it just cries out for justice. And investors have a real role here, particularly now with CSDDD and the EU and its global knock-on effects and the need for double materiality and disclosure of human rights risks, to show to engage here with the company and to make the case to them.
Thanks very much, Bennett. Thanks for really clearly illustrating both of those cases. And I think many can understand the need to acknowledge the importance of both, given this complex situation. And I don't know if there's anything kind of last things you might want to say specifically about, the expectations of investors if Dow remains intransigent in remediating harms. Are there any kind of specific things that investors could be expected to do?
Well, I think the most immediate thing is for investors to file shareholder resolutions, which is much easier, as we know, in the US than it is in most other jurisdictions. Not that it's always easy to pass muster with the SEC here, but to ask for full disclosure of efforts, which will show to be paltry, to remediate the site and to provide compensation for victims. I do think it's worth asking the company for an accounting of material costs related to this issue, as well as potential liability. So I would encourage investors to engage through shareholder advocacy, but also through direct dialogue, efforts at direct dialogue with the company. And of course, the last resort, and at this point, 4 decades on, maybe it should be the next tactic, is to urgently consider divestment. And there certainly is an ethical case for why institutional investors with an ESG bent would see the need to reason to divest from a company that is so grossly irresponsible on such a grave matter.
Thanks, Bennett. That's really helpful. You touched on legal risk, and I see that there's already some questions about this in the chat. So let me come back to Bennett's point about legal risk. We had a question specifically here from Tulia at Storebrand about the actual material impacts that the disasters had on Dow and what legal risks it faces. Gabby, so you've given us some of the answer here in the chat, and I wonder if anyone wants to jump in, Tim or Gabby, if you wanted to expand on this a bit about the legal risks and about the question of whether the company has sufficiently disclosed information to its shareholders. Tim, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure, Liz. Yeah. So, I mean, Bennett referred to some of the research that we did during some of the shareholder campaign work around 10 years ago. And at that time, it was easier to obtain information, certainly through right to information in India, on sort of commercial decisions that were being influenced by government departments, etc. So that right to information work threw up quite a lot of evidence for the stymieing of Dow's attempts to invest and develop its business in India. So, for example, we found that there were total business losses in India between 2008 and 2016 of a value of around $300 million, none of which had been disclosed, obviously, to the market, to shareholders and investors at the time. The figure was arrived at because there was a proposed 50-50 joint venture between Dow and an Indian company called GACL for producing chloromethanes that had to be cancelled in 2012. It was already around 3 or 4 years down the line at the time it was cancelled. So Dow lost anticipated revenues from that. Dow also had to abandon an R&D center that was an investment of $100 million and up because it was basically attacked by local activists on the basis that Dow was not a company that they wanted in their backyard, given its role in perpetuating the Bhopal disaster. And Dow had to write off between 10 and 15 million just on that investment. Dow also told US officials, this came out in State Department cables, that it had intended a $5 billion investment program in India. I think Andrew Liveris had been quoted as saying that the Indian market was exceedingly important to Dow. This was in around 2007, 2008. And at the time that Dow was talking to people in the embassy in Mumbai, the US embassy, they basically said that $5 billion investment program had to be abandoned. That was in 2009. So Dow had major plans from India that had to be completely rewritten and lost significant amounts of money that we know just in that period, 2008 to 2016. We don't have many details for the period of time since then, unfortunately. Just in terms of, I also brought up the fact that Dow hadn't let the market know that this was going on. Here's an extraordinary fact. In 2010, Andrew Liveris decided not to go to India at the time that President Obama was visiting. The two were in quite close contact, it seems, because Mr. Liveris had visited the White House more than 50 times in a number of years during President Obama's presidency. But Mr. Liveris declined to go to India because he feared arrest if he set foot in the country. Again, this was a material risk to Dow and its reputation that was never declared in any official documentation to the SEC and was not declared in terms of any communications with shareholders and investors. In fact, quite the opposite happened. Dow was basically engaging in non-disclosure and omissions in its official filings. So in 2016, writing on behalf of the ICJB, I wrote to the boards of both Dow and DuPont. And this was a few days before there was going to be a vote on the merger between Dow and DuPont going forward. And the letter that I wrote pointed out the material impacts on Dow, the reputational impacts from Bhopal, and the fact that none of these matters have been disclosed in any of the merger documents or communications with shareholders and investors ahead of that vote. And it invited the boards of both companies to remedy those disclosure violations, violations of their fiduciary duties. The letter got no response, and neither of the two boards made any effort to remedy those non-disclosure violations ahead of the vote.
Thanks very much, Tim. That's really helpful. I see there's another question that I think has been answered about assessing whether the company has done sufficient due diligence in assessing its involvement, and Gabby has mentioned that it has never done assessment of its connection with Bhopal. And we have another question that's come up in the chat. I'm not sure who this is aimed at, but the question is, can the JAM versus IFC case in the US Supreme Court, I don't know where that get, be used as precedent to prepare a legal case against Dow in the US for their crimes in Bhopal? And I wonder if anyone would like to take a crack at that.
Not optimistic given the current complexion of the US Supreme Court.
I just wanted to add, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question on the legal precedent, but I just wanted to mention that the Amnesty report has a full section that summarizes many of the adverse financial and reputational impacts and lost opportunities for Dow in India that Tim was referencing. So it's a short section within the report that can give a really good idea of the impact that the Bhopal legacy has had on Dow. And I also wanted to mention that indeed one of the lowest hanging fruit, I would say, in terms of Dow's position is to, if Dow really believes that it has done everything right and it has met its responsibility to respect human rights in relation to Bhopal, it should just say so and it should demonstrate it. And that's the minimum that investors should ask. That's fine. You say that you have nothing to do, there are no outstanding liabilities, and you're not connected in any way, and you're not doing anything wrong with Bhopal. That is fine. But if you are claiming to abide by the UNGPs, at least the minimum that Dow should be doing is assess Bhopal and its connection to Bhopal through the lens of the UNGPs, perform a due diligence assessment, and then publish those findings, because that would contribute a big deal into the conversation and understand Dow's position. And if Dow is able to prove that it's got no connection or no outstanding liabilities or responsibilities, then it should do so through the lens of the UNGPs. And I would ask investors to ask that at a minimum.
Thanks very much, Gabby. I wonder, so there's a question here from Rebecca, thanks. Given financial materiality disclosure requirements in the US and disclosure requirements in the EU under the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is there any recourse that investors have in terms of forcing Dow to undertake more holistic material and salient human rights disclosures? So this is looking both to the US and across the pond, where we have more and more emerging legislation pushing companies on disclosure. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, whether that could be a toehold for investors, or remains to be seen?
Remains to be seen, but worth trying any and every angle at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's important for investors to remember that some of this emerging legislation, even if it's emerging in Europe, will capture US companies and others, depending on whether they sell into the common market or the size of their turnover. So it isn't simply a question of companies in one jurisdiction being the only ones covered by those laws. So I think it's important to remember that this is kind of spreading the web. This is something that John Ruggie talked about, that the web of liability is growing with the years. So I don't think we have any other questions, and I know I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca for one last thing. So if there are no further questions, then I would just close by saying that I hope that everyone found today's briefing useful. And I hope that it's clear as well that it's incumbent on investors to listen to a range of voices in evaluating company performance. And as shareholders, you speak to the company with a different voice, and one that may be more likely to be heard than that of other stakeholders. And so we thank everybody for coming. And I'd like to turn it back to Rebecca for the very last word.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I mean, fantastic job moderating. Thank you to all of those who presented today. I think it was really informative, just to understand the severity of this ongoing crisis, but also potentially a bit hopeful, seeing what students are doing to mobilize, and now knowing also what steps investors can take as well in this ongoing battle to hold Dow to account and provide the necessary remediation to victims. So thank you, everybody. Just wanted to very briefly say, and he's on the call, I saw him, if any of the investors on this call are interested in potentially engaging Dow to push for remedy for victims and for cleanup, of this disaster, please do reach out to Dominic Twomey. He is the Business and Human Rights Campaigner at Amnesty International. He is headquartered in the UK. You see here on the screen his contact information. And just, so I really do encourage investors to reach out and see what's still hopefully possible to do now that we've reached this tragic anniversary. So thank you, everyone, again. And we will be making this recording available. If there's any colleagues that you would like to share this with, please do feel free to do so. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.